Good evening to everyone. On behalf of Beth Jacob Congregation, I want to welcome everyone to this very, very exciting program. Thank you so much to our strong group of Israel advocates who are going to help us facilitate the program, and to our guest of honor, Stuart Sloame, who is going to be sharing a phenomenally important story of his initiatives and the work that he's doing to support Israel in a very hostile environment globally, and making serious and important strides on behalf of Israel advocacy and of the Jewish people. I want to just express our appreciation to the sponsors of our entire Modern Minds series, and this is a Modern Minds conversation in the truest sense of the word, in that it's a conversation between a group of Israel advocates from within our community, and sharing about important topics that are really on the top of our minds as passionate Zionist Jews throughout the community. With that, I want to just, again, on behalf of Beth Jacob, thank everyone for joining us. I'm going to pass it over to Rabbi Paul Gelb, who's going to lead the moderation of this conversation together with Stuart and John Rotter and Jonathan Stieglitz.
I'd like to thank you, Rabbi Posey and Rabbi Top, for facilitating this, and to the Beth Jacob community. This is a very important topic. Obviously, we know that the UN has had some hostility to Israel, to say the least. That's sort of an understatement. And yet, there are people who believe that this can change. Not only that, but this small group of dedicated people are actually working on a daily basis to do this in a very effective way, in a very interesting way. Stuart is one of the people leading the charge of this. Stuart is part of the AJIRI, the American Jewish International Relations Institute. He comes from New York City, went to Ramaz and Horace Mann, went to Columbia University undergraduate, Columbia University Law School. He has an LLM from Brooklyn Law School. He served in the Reagan administration as the HUD, Deputy General Counsel, and also as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development. He was a vice president and a member of the board of the American Jewish Committee's Washington chapter. He founded and chaired the Energy Task Force for 10 years. He's on the International Relations Committee for the American Jewish Committee. He was also the vice chairman of the Israel Project. He's practiced law in New York and Washington, D.C. He now lives in Los Angeles. He's a member of Beth Am, very intelligent and dedicated person. We're very fortunate to hear from him tonight. I'll let him describe the work directly, and then we'll have questions and answers after that. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Appreciate it. Before I start with my remarks, I want to sort of give an update. The Ajiri recently became affiliated with B'nai B'rith. It's a totally independent, I don't know, they call it a committee or something. But that happened last October, around the time of the death of our founder and chairman, Ambassador Richard Shifter. So I just wanted to clarify that wasn't in the bio, in the topic. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of a history lesson about the UN and how we are in the situation we are in before I get to voting. I just got an email asking me what the password is. And it's, what was it again? I'm sorry.
456 capital B.
Okay. I apologize. This is my sister, so I guess I better do it. Let's see. Okay, come on here. Apologize for this. Okay, 456, capital B. Got it. I'm sorry. So as I started to say, it's generally known that the UN has been dealing unfairly with Israel.
Before you get started, I think you turned off the video. If you could turn it back on, that'd be great.
Okay, let me see what I can do here. Go to Zoom.
We've all had to become technologically savvy in the last year.
Zoom, where are you? You know, I apologize for this. I shouldn't have answered my sister. Where is it? Here we go. This should work.
Got it. Got it.
Good. Okay. So it's generally known that the UN has been dealing unfairly with Israel, but the details are not generally known. So before I turn to what my organization actually does, I think it would be helpful to give some history. The UN, as you know, was formed in 1945. Its purpose was to empower the cause of world peace. But after 1974, efforts were made to end the existence of Israel as a majority Jewish state through the support of the so-called right of return, and force Israel to accept the 5.5 million so-called refugees who call themselves Palestinians, which would result in the end of the Jewish majority in Israel. In other words, the right of return is a euphemism for the destruction of Israel. The effort was also aimed to weaken the US position internationally by isolating it in Israel from the rest of the international community. Where did this claim of a right of return of 5.5 million so-called Palestinian refugees come from? That claim takes us back to 1949, when the Arab states that had in 1948 attacked the newly created state of Israel had signed armistice agreements with Israel. When these agreements were signed, about 700,000 Arabs who had lived in the territory that was now the state of Israel found themselves on the Arab side of the armistice demarcation lines, the so-called Green Line, to which most had fled to stay out of the combat zones. And some were urged to do that by the Arab armies. The places to which they had fled were immediately adjacent to the land of Israel, including parts of what had been the mandate of Palestine, the Jordan-occupied West Bank, and also the Egypt-occupied Gaza area, plus Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. But unlike the European refugees of World War II, who were resettled in the countries to which they had fled, the Arab refugees from what had become the state of Israel were not resettled in the communities in which they lived, communities where people were of the same ethnicity, spoke the same language, and had the same religion as the refugees. They and the governments of the countries in which they lived insisted on the return of these refugees to the homes that they had abandoned in Israel. However, it's not only the refugees who fled who are classified by the UN as Palestinian refugees. The UN also provided, as distinct from other refugees worldwide, that the refugee status would be inherited generation after generation. As a result, we are now dealing with 5.5 million so-called Palestinian refugees, less than 1%, or no more than 40,000 of whom are refugees of 1948, 1949. And more than 99% of whom are descendants of the refugees. You even have great-grandchildren now. Their mass migration to Israel, as I said, would reduce the Jewish population of Israel to a minority, and would thus end the existence of the state of Israel. And of course, for Israel, this is a non-starter. So what began the takeover of the UN General Assembly by enemies of Israel? In 1974, Fidel Castro, who was determined to weaken the US internationally, and Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, determined to eliminate the Jewish state, were both candidates for leadership in the non-aligned movement. They joined forces and succeeded in putting together a majority coalition in the UN General Assembly. It consisted of the Soviet bloc, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, which is now known as the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and a majority of African states that were attracted by slogans of anti-colonialism and Zionism is racist. The latter resolution was ultimately repealed, as you know, but the UN support of the right of return remains to this day a major obstacle to the conclusion of a meaningful peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. Further, the penetration of the UN Secretariat by anti-Israel operatives has had the effect of installing anti-Israel sentiments into a large part of the UN staff. Now, how is the UN endorsement of the right of return accomplished? One of the first steps was to invite Yasser Arafat to address the UN General Assembly in September 1974. Wearing a pistol, he delivered a speech that lasted more than 2 hours. A few weeks later, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 3236, in which it recognized the inalienable right of the Palestinians to return to their homes and property from which they had been displaced and uprooted. The resolution then declared that the General Assembly calls for their return. In 1975, the General Assembly took a critically important step. It created the UN's central anti-Israel apparatus, which operates to this very day, by establishing the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, which in acronym is CEIRPP, but I'm going to call it from now on the committee. The committee's work in getting the anti-Israel message out was undertaken initially by the staff with Cuban staff members in the lead. 2 years later, the organizers requested the Secretary General to establish within the Secretariat a special unit on Palestinian rights, which would prepare studies and publications relating to the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. It annually holds 4 major conferences around the world, different cities around the world, to bash Israel. In 1979, its name was changed to the Division for Palestinian Rights, and it's on the same organizational line of the Secretariat as the Americas and Europe, that's one division, the 2 African divisions, the Asia and Pacific division, and the West Asia and Middle East division. And then you have the Division for Palestinian Rights. Its statement of purpose is to support the right of return. The Division for Palestinian Rights, which I'll call the division or DPR, has 15 people on the payroll with the task of spreading the anti-Israel message. Thus, in violation of its charter, the UN has built within its system an apparatus designed to destroy one of its 193 member states. You've all heard of UNRWA, an agency of the UN, one of whose purposes is to maintain that list of millions of people of Arab ethnicity whose mass migration to Israel the UN plans to sponsor. So the committee gets the message out in support of the mass migration. The division uses the UN system to win international support of the cause which to destroy the state of Israel. The goal is to get the UN Security Council to sponsor the mass migration, ordering Israel to accept them. A US veto can, of course, prevent this, but the proponents believe that they will ultimately cause the US to give in and allow the Security Council to adopt the right of return resolution, which would enjoy the status of international law by getting worldwide support. So how can one expect a Palestinian leader to give up the right of return, even if the leader wanted to, if year after year the UN endorses it? This is not known by most heads of state, and therefore it's up to the US to get this message out. What then can be done to minimize the harm? My organization, Ajiri, was founded in 2005 with a strategy to combat the UN effort to delegitimize Israel. First, by reducing the need for the US to veto anti-Israel resolutions in the Security Council, and over a longer period to reduce the about 20 annual resolutions in the General Assembly, which are overwhelmingly anti-Israel. Most of those resolutions are merely declarative and do not have adverse operational consequences. They're just hot air. But 2 resolutions have real consequences and thus are damaging to Israel. Before getting to those 2 annual General Assembly resolutions, I will turn to the Security Council, where the resolutions have the force of international law, not just recommendations. For years, the US, as a permanent member of the Security Council, exercised its veto to protect Israel. For example, between 1972 and 2006, the US cast 41 vetoes. This had the effect of making the US and Israel pariah nations against the will of the international community. But what if an American administration refused to veto an anti-Israel resolution? We saw that happen at the end of 2016. This leads to a jury. A jury strategy was devised by former Assistant Secretary for Human Rights and former Deputy Ambassador to the UN, Richard Shifter, and who was the late founder and chairman of a jury. And he passed away, as I mentioned, last year at the age of 97. The strategy is predicated on the little-known fact that quite a few countries' UN ambassadors vote without consulting with their heads of government. Decisions are made by their UN ambassadors, or in some cases, foreign ministries. It's easier and more rewarding for the UN ambassadors of countries with no dog in the fight to go along to get along. They get all kinds of perks if they do that, committee chairmanship, and I won't mention it, but other emoluments. We also knew that for a Security Council resolution to pass, thereby forcing the US to veto it, it needed 9 affirmative votes out of the 15 members. There are 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent members. These non-permanent members represent regions and they rotate for 2-year terms. So when an anti-Israel resolution is proposed in the Security Council, Israel can, in most cases, can count on the vote of the US, the UK, and France, and the 2 non-permanent EU members. There are always 2 EU members on that rotating basis, for a total of 5. This means that the proponents of the resolution need 9 of the remaining 10 members to vote in favor of the resolution and force a veto. But we only need 2 abstentions, not even no votes, to prevent the necessary 9 yes votes. And as a practical matter, since votes are solicited and counted ahead of time, the resolution would be tabled and no vote would be held, commonly known as a whipping operation. So the questions we faced were how to identify and persuade the 2 members we needed to abstain. First, we divided the UN membership into 4 parts: friends of the US and Israel, enemies of Israel, such as the 57 members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, sure to vote for anti-Israel resolutions. There are members who vote against the US and Israel for purely geopolitical reasons, such as Russia, China, Cuba, Venezuela, Ecuador, and until recently, Brazil. And members that are essentially neutral in that they have no major foreign policy differences with the US, but vote along with the majority against Israel, often in those countries where the heads of state pay no attention to the votes of their UN ambassador. Importantly, we examined the members of the latter group and identified those countries that receive US foreign aid. Second, in 2006, Ambassador Shifter and I met with the 2 House of Representatives whips, Maryland Democrat Steny Hoyer, now Majority Leader, and Missouri Republican Congressman, now Senator Roy Blunt, both staunchly pro-Israel. We outlined our analysis and suggested they identify and give their blessing to members who are likely to play a role, especially those on the Foreign Relations Committee, which oversees the foreign aid budget. They agreed, and they brought to the meeting a number of like-minded members who would agree to adopt the country, which we would identify, starting with those newly elected to the Security Council. The plan was that a jury would do the research, in part by examining the State Department's annual voting coincidence report, which tracks the vote of all UN members on the 25 annual resolutions the State Department deemed important and compares their votes with how the US voted. The jury would then draft a letter addressed to the head of state of the individual country, which, after any changes by the member, would be signed by the congressman. The letter would start by reciting the friendship between our countries and the absence of major foreign policy differences. It would go on, this is between US and these other countries, doesn't mention Israel, because it's like big Satan, little Satan. It's the same thing. They're voting against us, they're voting against Israel. The letter goes on to point out that the country had, let's say, over the last 3 years, voted 67% of the time against the way the US voted. And it concludes by urging the head of state to request the country's UN ambassador to alert him or her the next time the ambassador learned that the US intended to vote against a resolution. As I said, we always wrote about votes against the US, not Israel, because often these resolutions involve Israel anyway. The congressman would then invite to his office the country's bilateral ambassador in Washington, whose job is to maintain good relations with the US and keep the money flowing. The congressman would then discuss the contents of the letter and hand it to the ambassador for delivery to the head of state in the diplomatic pouch. It was often followed up by direct contact between the congressman or often congressional leadership and the head of state. This strategy worked virtually every single time. As proof, between 2006, when we started, and today, remember I said 41 votes between vetoes between 1972 and 2006. When we started in 2006, between then and today, the US has had to exercise its veto only 3 times. Let me give you a couple of examples of our successes with anecdotes. Colombia, the country, was consistently voting against Israel, despite receiving the 3rd most foreign aid after Israel and Egypt. It was given to combat the drug cartels then. In this case, we involved the senator, the late Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania, who was personally friendly with Colombia's President Uribe. The senator called Uribe, and the votes in the UN shifted more favorably. Uribe was unaware of how his ambassador in the UN voted. A few years ago, a small African country, Burkina Faso, which had just been elected to the Security Council, was consistently voting against the US and Israel, despite having received from the State Department a Millennium Challenge grant of $400 million awarded to nations which had taken positive steps towards democracy, transparency, and the rule of law. Northern Virginia Congressman Frank Wolf, now retired, volunteered. He called the embassy and asked for the ambassador. He was told the ambassador was back in the Capitol, and it was suggested to him that the congressman called the UN ambassador. Congressman Frank blew up, exclaiming, "What the hell do you people have an embassy for?" Within 48 hours, the ambassador returned from Africa, was in Frank's office together with the secretary of their cabinet. 6 weeks later, the State Department reported that Burkina Faso had done an about-face and was now voting with the US. When the proponents of the anti-Israel Security Council resolution discover they don't have the 9 affirmative votes to force the UN into an embarrassing veto, the resolutions are tabled. Thus, for example, after Gilead Shalit was abducted in Gaza and Israel mounted an armed excursion, the UN Human Rights Council took up the matter and referred the infamous Goldstone report to the Security Council with a recommendation to take action against Israel. No vote was taken. The same with subsequent Gaza wars. In 2012, however, Mahmoud Abbas thought he had the votes for Palestinian statehood, and the Arab representative on the Security Council introduced the resolution. But to Abbas's surprise, Togo and Nigeria abstained. after heavy lobbying, and the resolution failed to get 9 affirmative votes. The decision by Nigeria to abstain came in the final hour. Ambassador Shifter called the former Israeli ambassador to the UN, who in turn called Bibi to point out well, we were just a vote away from a setting in which no veto would be needed. Prime Minister Netanyahu called the Nigerian president, Jonathan Goodluck, who called his ambassador to the UN to instruct him that Nigeria should abstain. The 2 annual General Assembly resolutions, back to the General Assembly, that are the most critically important are the resolutions that extend the mandates, and most importantly, the funding authorizations for the committee. That's the committee, as I told you, on the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, in which 26 UN member states are represented, and the division, that's the Division of Palestinian Rights, in the Secretariat. As I mentioned, these provide UN support for the claim of a right of return. And with a massive population transfer of Palestinians, it would be the end of the state of Israel as a majority Jewish state. As a jury sees the situation, there are indeed a number of UN member states that would favor efforts to end Israel's existence. But we also believe that the heads of government of a significant number of states that either vote for these 2 resolutions or abstain are simply not aware of their true meaning. The Palestinian leadership, of course, understands the meaning of the resolutions very well. Why is that? It's because their texts are cleverly worded so that the term right of return does not appear in them. Instead, the relevant texts use wording that needs to be carefully examined to lead the reader to recognize that the resolutions espouse this right of return. It is by making both diplomats and members of Congress aware of the true meaning of the committee and the division that the jury has gotten the word out on the General Assembly's role in interfering with the efforts to attain an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. Paul, can you put up the voting chart now?
Yes, I will. Let me,
I'll start talking while you
okay,
get
I'll
together.
share the screen.
The committee and the division resolutions were once again adopted by the UN General Assembly on December 3, 2019, and on December 2, 2020. But there were a number of very favorable developments. We believe that the Algeria effort played a role in important vote changes brought about through the intercession of members of Congress with presidents and prime ministers directly. In 2019, the number of yes votes on the division resolution dropped from 96 to 87. And in 2020, the yes votes further dropped to 82, a historic low. Now that you could see on the chart with the blue and the red beginning to get together. The blue is the yes, the red is the no. So you can see how it converges. Not yet, we're not there yet. But there were a number, so what I was saying was that in 2019, as I said, the division resolution dropped to 82, a historic low. Jury's work resulted in 15 members of Congress from both parties sending letters to 40 countries, raising concerns about how these countries have voted on these resolutions historically. We also held calls with ambassadors to over 10 countries and coordinated our efforts with the US State Department and the Israeli Foreign Ministry. While progress in the UN can be excruciatingly slow, particularly in the face of significant efforts by those opposed to our aims, we are pleased with the progress this year. Now I'll break down the change in the voting pattern. First, Europe and Asia. For years, the United States and Israel have been joined in casting no votes only by Australia, Canada, a few Pacific Island states, and from 2018, Hungary. A few years ago, congressional intercession helped by a jury paid off by adding Guatemala and Honduras to the no votes. But the big change was in the EU votes on the division resolution led by Germany. For many years, the voting pattern of the 28 EU member states had been yes, 2, which is Cyprus and Malta, no, 0, abstain, 26. In 2019, we saw a truly striking change. Yes, 2, no, 12, abstain, 14. Hungary had switched from abstain to no in 2018, but Hungary was no longer alone in 2019. It was joined by 11 other EU member states. We believe that Germany played a key role in this change in voting pattern. With the help of a jury, Congressman Steny Hoyer, now majority leader, sent a letter to the foreign minister of Germany. We believe that letter positively influenced the vote of not only Germany, but 10 other EU members: Austria, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Greece, Lithuania, Netherlands, Romania, and Slovakia. In 2020, Switzerland and Slovenia changed their votes to no. We will work very hard to pick up additional European votes in 2021, including the UK and perhaps 9 more: Albania, Croatia, Latvia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Moldova, Poland, and Ukraine. Now, in Latin America, the story is a little different. In 2017, Guatemala was the first country to cross over to vote no on both resolutions. In 2018, it was joined by Honduras. And in 2019, Brazil and Colombia made it 4. Heads of government do not normally spend time focusing on UN resolutions. It is necessary to call their attention to the fact that certain UN resolutions contravene the basic policies of their respective governments. The challenge for 2021 is to identify those states, such as Uruguay, that can join the foregoing 4. We had hopes for Bolivia in 2019 when the interim president, a born-again Christian who was extremely pro-Israel, had managed to oust the leftist government. Unfortunately, she was defeated at the polls. In the Caribbean, the 14 Caribbean states are divided equally between those that vote yes and those that are absent. Absent were Bahamas, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Haiti, St. Kitts, and Trinidad and Tobago. An abstain vote means that a state casting that vote makes it clear it is not for the resolution, but does not feel strongly enough to vote no. An absence, on the other hand, may in some cases mean that the delegation in question does not have an officer available to be present at the UN General Assembly session. In many cases, however, it means something quite different, namely that the state is not for the resolution, but wants to obscure that fact. Ambassador Schifter often told the story that at the beginning of a session of the UN Human Rights Commission, at which he represented the United States, an ambassador from one of the smaller countries came up to him and said the following: "I have been instructed to tell you that anytime you don't want me to be in the room, tell me that and I won't be in the room." Now in Africa, there are 54 states in the UN Africa group. They can be divided between the 10 North African states, all of whom are members of the Arab League, and the 44 states in sub-Saharan Africa. A jury's attention obviously focuses on sub-Saharan Africa. Here we can note a significant change between voting patterns on the division resolution in 2018 and 2019. In 2018, 28 states voted yes, 6 abstained, and 10 were absent. In 2019, 21 states voted yes, 7 abstained, and 16 were absent. In 2020, there were 3 additional abstentions. Significantly, only a minority of the 44 sub-Saharan African states voted for the division resolution. That too was the first time. So in summing up, As you know, the UN has 193 members. That means that a bare majority of the membership would be 97. At the current session, for the second time in decades, the yes votes on both resolutions were less than a majority of the UN membership. That, of course, does not mean that the resolutions were defeated, because the no votes were still quite low. But it appears that a number of states are reached by the message that they should not vote yes on the anti-Israel resolutions. On the division resolution, as I said, the yes vote was down from 96 in 2018 to 87 in 2019. And in 2020, the yes vote was down to 82, while 56 abstained and 27 were absent. But there's another way we may be able to hurt the division and the committee, by defunding them. Both raise budgetary questions in that their operations need to be funded out of the UN budget. Under the charter, the UN charter, the resolutions require a 2/3 majority for funding resolutions to pass. That means we only need to get a 1/3 + 1 blocking minority, which would require the movement of 11 countries from yes to abstain or absent, and 11 countries from abstain absent to no. So as we look ahead to the 2021 session, we certainly need to identify again the yes votes cast by states whose heads of government would not vote yes if they understood the meaning of the committee and the division. Finally, Israel and American Jews' view of the UN. For a long time, Israel really didn't care about the UN and its anti-Israel activities. In fact, David Ben-Gurion coined an expression to show where he stood. Shmun. In colloquial Brooklyn English, it would mean UN, forget about it. But even General Assembly advisory resolutions are important. Resolution 1, by the way, Israel at the time was much more interested in getting bilateral relations, and they were willing to give a wink and a nod to countries that had bilateral relations with them, but still voted against them in the UN. That, as I'll explain, that's changed. Resolution 181 in 1948 partitioned the British Mandate of Palestine into 3 parts: Israel, Palestine, and an independent Jerusalem. But due to Arab opposition, there was no Security Council vote. Nevertheless, that resolution triggered Israel's declaration of independence. Then there was the case of South Africa. The General Assembly passed a very strong resolution boycotting and sanctioning South Africa for its apartheid, and set up an office in the Secretariat to track how each country implemented the resolution. Although the UK would not permit a Security Council resolution to pass, the GA resolution effectively brought down the South African government. Thanks in part to Israel's former ambassador to the US, Ron Dermer, Israel has since 2016 changed its view about the UN. As I said, previously Israel was content with having bilateral relations with as many countries as possible and would overlook their UN votes. But in 2016, in July of 2017, at a summit with African leaders, Prime Minister Netanyahu listed as one of Israel's priorities in international affairs the changing of anti-Israel votes in the UN, when he discussed how Israel could help other countries with agriculture, energy, water, conservation, and technology. So you see, before it was only the US had leverage with the foreign aid budget. Now Israel has leverage. Other countries want what Israel has to offer, and they're going to have to change their votes if they want it, hopefully. As for American Jews, we have discovered that many feel the UN is a lost cause. We don't agree. We recognize the enormous damage that the UN can do to Israel, but we deny that it is hopeless. And we have seen a change for which we take a small modicum of credit. It is our mission, in addition to help change UN votes, to alert the Jewish community about both the dangers and the opportunities. And for both of these missions, I need your help. If you are reasonably close to a member of Congress or senator and can aid in setting up a meeting, we would welcome that. And we would welcome your help in arranging, spreading the word about what we can do in a jury, or in arranging for future webinars before other groups, such as this. We also need your financial support. If you are so inclined, you can go to our website, which is www.ajuri.us, which accepts credit cards. Or you can send a check to Ajuri, P.O. Box 42732, Washington, D.C. 20015. Donors older than 70 and a half who have required minimum distributions from their IRA might wish to make donations from their IRA. Thank you, and I welcome questions.
Stuart, thank you. And it's refreshing and energizing to know that there is some hope, this optimism about the UN, maybe not the whole thing, but piece by piece. And I know that there are a lot of questions. I'd like to start the questions with my comrades in arms, John Rotter and Jonathan Stieglitz. We work together a lot on litigations, mostly against the ACLU these days, unfortunately. But they're, as you know, they're very knowledgeable about these issues. I'd like for them to start with questions in the last 20 minutes of this hour for a few minutes, and then we'll have some additional questions from the broader group. John Rotter, please start.
Sure. So Stuart, you've been working on this project for about 15 years now, and obviously you saw some possibility at the beginning to make progress. How would you describe your degree of optimism now compared to when you were starting out?
Well, I think in this, as for the Security Council, we have succeeded. As I mentioned, only 3 vetoes. There should have been a 4th one, but there wasn't in 2016. So I think our strategy works, and especially with those 2 African countries that are on the rotating 2-year terms. In terms of the General Assembly, as I pointed out, on the one hand, most of those resolutions are hot air. On the other hand, the 2 that fund those 2, the division and the committee, can hurt. And so, as I mentioned, we're making real progress. Whether we'll be able to kill them entirely in a few years, I can't say. I'm hopeful, though, and it's worth investing our time because it still sends the message out about Israel and the U.S.
Very good. What's the budget for the committee and the division?
Well, at the present time, that's a good question. I don't have the answer. I apologize. I'll look it up and get back to you.
No problem. To what degree did the domestic U.S. politics play a role in moving the votes in the last 4 years in terms of having Nikki Haley as the UN ambassador and her promise to take names of people who were not aligned with the U.S. and so on, and how might that change over the next 4 years?
I don't think it will change. It hasn't changed since Nikki Haley left, and it won't change now. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from the newly confirmed UN ambassador. And so I'm looking for it. I have the exact quote for it. Here she made it very clear that she was very positively disposed to Israel in every way. Here it is. On the issue of Israel, this is a quote, President Biden has been one of Israel's strongest supporters over the last 50 years of his career. You all know that quite well. And the president believes that our ties between our 2 countries are rooted in our strategic interests and our shared values. So if I am confirmed as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, I look forward to standing with Israel, standing against the unfair targeting of Israel, the relentless resolutions that are proposed against Israel unfairly. And I look forward to work closely with the Israeli embassy, with the Israeli ambassador to bolster Israel's security and to expand economic opportunities for Israelis and Americans alike, and to widen the circle of peace. I think it goes without saying that Israel has no closer friend than the United States. And I will reflect that in my actions at the United Nations. That's pretty good. We helped a little bit with a question from some of the senators, but that's as good as you can get. We couldn't have written it any better. And so I have every reason for optimism.
Great. Jonathan Stieglitz?
Just some very specific questions I had were, you were talking about the Security Council. Do we know exactly which countries are the non-permanent members? Do we know what their rotation is? And so are you going after them in advance of their time on the Security Council?
Well, they get elected for 2-year terms. Each one represents a region. There's a couple from Africa, and all the different regions have their own. And they're voted on, I think it's a 2/3 vote in the General Assembly, which is why Canada never got on the Security Council, because they're too friendly to Israel. And that's why there was one issue not too long ago, last year, in which Canada took a different position, and Trudeau was severely criticized for that. And it was understood that that was his effort to get Canada a Security Council position. But wholly aside from that, so as soon as they're elected I'm not sure it's November or December, I think it's November of the session, then those countries are identified. And we start going after them and we know who we have a chance at and who we don't have a chance at. So it varies. Some years we don't have a chance, and that's the way it is. But some years we do, as I pointed out with that key vote on Palestinian statehood. Abbas really thought he had the votes lined up, and he actually had until the last minute when intense lobbying changed Togo and Nigeria's votes from yes to abstain.
So is it possible that, so that's basically what you're saying is it's possible that during that rotation that we just end up with so many countries that the US does have to do a veto. There's nothing that we can do about it.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, it only happened 3 times. Should have been 4, but it only happened 3 times since 2006. So we have a pretty good track record. And, it's got to get better because it can't get much better than that. But I'm optimistic because Israel is getting better press and all the countries want what Israel has to offer now. Look at the vaccine. That's critically important. Israel is now recognized as one of the technological leaders in the world. And we all know about the air and the climate change and water conservation and other technologies. But the way they distributed the vaccine so effectively, better than any country in the world, has got to impress some of these countries. Already, Israel is beginning to give some of that Pfizer vaccine to a whole bunch of countries that requested it. And, that's positive. I can't predict the future, but I'm optimistic.
We have a question from the broader group, somebody who asked to remain anonymous, whether Ajiri's work overlaps with AIPAC and to what degree?
No. First of all, let me point out, we are the only organization that has one issue only, and that's UN, and specifically anti-Israel votes in UN. Even UN Watch has a broader agenda. As far as AIPAC is concerned, we work very closely with them. They help identify congressmen and senators who might be receptive to adopting a country or in other ways. the reason, by the way, we focus on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and to some extent the Armed Forces Committee is because these are the members who have an interest in foreign policy and would be more likely to do some of this work and get involved. Other members who are, focused on homegrown issues for their communities, states, may not have as much interest. So that's why, and of course, the other reason is the Foreign Relations Committee has authority over the budget, and the bilateral ambassadors know that. So AIPAC does a tremendous job, and they work on a variety of issues. Their focus is on Congress mainly, and to a lesser extent, the executive division. They don't really focus that much on the UN. So, but they do help us because their people are very close to various members and senators and can help us get meetings and so on.
Any role on the Abraham Accords in the work that you do?
Well, that's a question I sort of anticipated. I'm surprised it was the last question. I mean, the latest question. We were hoping that it would have a salutary effect, but it has, but not as much as we would like. First of all, those 4 countries that signed the accords with Israel all voted for the 2 resolutions. They voted yes. So that hasn't happened yet. There's no way to be sure what will happen in the future or quantify it. Hopefully, it'll help. Certainly, we're going to make the case when we engage people on the issues that these offices are increasingly anachronistic, especially given the changes in the Middle East. She brought, what's her name? Linda Thomas Greenfield, the new ambassador. She brought it up unprompted. And she said, as I quoted to you, that she wanted to see the positive new relationships created. So I think she'll be of great help in the UN. That's the most I can say because it's all up in the air at this point. But obviously, the better it looks for Israel and countries recognize them and so on and so forth, it has to have benefits at some point.
We'd like to take the last couple of minutes and open it up a little more widely. I know that Jerry Friedman has a question on tap. So the only issue is the technological logistics.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, so I'll ask my question.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me do this. So they just passed a $1.9 trillion bill that Nancy Pelosi said was the most progressive bill in history. So the progressive wing is having a powerful influence on the Democratic Party. And if the nice Jewish boy Bernie Sanders wing continues to be successful, they may end up electing a president who supports their point of view. And my question is, will the Democratic progressive president still keep supporting Israel by vetoing anti-Israel legislation in the UN?
Well, I can't get into partisan politics. As you know, Jury is a 501c3 charitable organizations. Obviously, you know that we're not allowed to engage in any partisan activity. However, I can say that the good news is that a vast majority of the country, the people, are pro-Israel. And the majority of the Democratic Party is also pro-Israel. I personally think that the progressive wing, so to speak, has been overstated in terms of its attitude towards Israel. I'll never forget my Congressman, Adam Schiff, at the AIPAC conference, the last live AIPAC conference in person, which was, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. We were asked the last day to go to our congressman's office and lobby for the 3 bills that AIPAC was interested in. So we went there. Well, of course, the 3 bills, he was already a co-sponsor. But before we started, the first thing he said was how happy he was to see us because we were the first time he ever got any Jews from AIPAC who were in his district. he had recently been redistricted from a district that had no Jews. So he was delighted. But then he started out without anybody asking a question. He said, I know what you're interested in. He said that you're concerned about the left wing of the Democratic Party. And he said, it's all about education. And I personally, I meaning him, have taken under my wing several young freshman congressmen and trying to help them understand it. Now, bear in mind that AIPAC, I don't know about this past year because of COVID, but traditionally, AIPAC sponsors an annual trip to Israel for all the freshmen. And that's headed, the Congress is headed, the one, not the Senate one, is headed by Steny Hoyer. And I forgot who the senator was in the last trip. All the congressmen go, those freshmen go on this trip with the exception of 2 or 3 members of the squad. The others of the progressive wing all went. And I find it hard to believe that after they come back from a trip in Israel, sponsored by AIPAC, that they come back with negative feelings. I think it has to make a difference. And of course, you know, we have our army. So I try to take the Israeli issue away from some of the economic issues. And by the way, I don't consider personally that President Biden is a progressive. He ran in the primaries as a centrist. I think he is. I think the COVID-19, the last bill, he felt had to be done. There were some parts of it which were favored by the progressives, but I don't call him a Sanders or any one of those others. That's my own opinion, not a jury's opinion.
Robin Gottlieb has a question. If you're able to unmute. Is it working?
Yes, I just wanted to know how many UN resolutions have been against Iran?
Well, since I focus on the anti-Israel resolutions, I haven't really kept up the count, but we do know that there were a number relating to the nuclear issue and to their arms export and import, some of whom have been lifted by now. Those are the important ones.
I was just, thinking about the balance, there's no resolutions against North Korea. I mean, it's hard to change our minds about the UN when there's so much Israel bashing.
I understand that. That's why a jury is so important. We get it, but as I pointed out, of the 20 annual anti-Israel resolutions, there are only 2 that can hurt Israel. Yes, we'd like to have 0, not 20, but the 2 that hurt are the ones that are both run by operatives in the Secretariat who are anti-Israel. But the more important thing is that UN resolutions on the right of return. And you have to understand how, even if there was a true moderate who was a leader who could try to come to a peace agreement with Israel, and I have my doubts now, but yeah, he has to face that can he be more moderate than the UN, which passes these right of return resolutions? It makes it difficult because it's institutional. So that's why those 2 are important. But we're working hard at it, and we're making progress. And so, yes, a lot of people think it's a hopeless cause, but it's not. You heard if there are only 3 vetoes necessary and no terrible resolutions in the Security Council, which have the force of international law, so it's not so bad. And if the General Assembly were down to only 2 that really can hurt Israel, and we're making good progress, I'm very hopeful about it.
Well, it's so great that you and Ambassador Shifter have been at this, chipping away at this for so long, that you've identified the Security Council and 2 General Assembly resolutions each year, piece by piece. Hopefully, it seems like a lot of momentum is gaining, and hopefully we'll have a cascade effect, tipping point. And it sounds like you already are. So it's really thrilling to hear this. It's always nice to hear good news. Reading that, you don't always get good news. And it's really wonderful to spend the evening together, and hopefully we will again in the future. Thank you very much. And thank you, Rabbi Posey and Rabbi Top, and to Beth Jacob. It's a privilege to meet together like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
And I want to thank you for inviting me for this. I mean, this is part of my job, is to get the word out. And I'm hoping that some of you may have some contacts that we could use. As I mentioned in my remarks, let me know, or let the 3 activists who are asking the questions, let them know. And that would be very, very important. The more congressmen and senators who are helping us, the better. And so that's very, very important. Secondly, getting the word out. This is one way, or the way I use to get the word out, these kinds of webinars. And so if you have friends who are, for example, who are members of other synagogues or JCs or whatnot, any Jewish organization that you want, you can persuade them to have a speaker. I will go anywhere with webinars. No travel, I just get on the tube. So I
thank you very
appreciate
much.
and I thank you very much.
Thank
On behalf
you.
of the shul, I
Bravo.
just want to say thank you to all of those who were involved. Thank you so much again, Stuart, for your wonderful activism. Also, our appreciation to Heidi and Albert Pra, who are the sponsors of our Modern Minds Conversation program. Special thank you to Paul Gell, Jonathan Stieglitz, and Jonathan Rotter. We want to thank everyone else for all of your activism and for joining us this evening. I want to wish everyone a Laila Tov.